to the cloud. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jen Bonet, and I'm the Executive Director of the Creative Coast. And today's lunchtime topic is hiring your first salesperson or personnel with a very good friend of mine out of Atlanta, Steve Quehl, who's a partner at TechCXO and a long-term mentor at ATDC, my former home, the Advanced Technology Development Center in the state of Georgia's technology incubator. And so a couple of people had requested that we have this presentation. And I'm glad you're able to join us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Well, thanks, Jen, and welcome everybody. And first of all, I want to take my hat off to Jen. Having known her and the job she did at the ATDC, I'm quite convinced that the same result is going to accrue to the Savannah community, and all you are lucky to have her. So I'm glad to be part of your conversation today. The topic that was presented to me is, how do we go about, or when do we go about, or what's the best way to introduce the sales function into an emerging tech organization? And so I have a very scientific answer for you, which is, it depends. I can't help but harken back to this is a fairly arcane cultural reference here, but that back in the last century, there were commercials for a product called Liquid Plumber, with the tagline for which was, just pour it in and it works. And trust me, that's not how sales is at best introduced to an organization. There's a little thought that needs to go into it. And if you study journalism, it's probably time to ask some of those kinds of questions, the who, what, when, why, where, et cetera. But I think the focus has got to be on, for those companies that are contemplating or seeking now to grow out of their emergent shell and into the marketplace, who really is your customer? Are they consumer? Are they commercial or industrial? What problem are they trying to solve that you may address better than the competition, but is what you have a must-have or a nice-to-have? Does it fill a want or a need? And how do they, or how do they manifest that they will buy? Is this a commodity that they price competitively, or is it a solution, or is it a service? And more importantly, how do they buy? They have a buying process, and they have preferences on how they wish to buy. They have, in many cases, very entrenched models for purchasing. Do they tend to go through direct? Do they prefer to buy direct, or would they go through a channel? Because everybody wants to buy from a trusted source. So these are questions that need to be raised and answered at every stage and continuously, not just at the beginning. I think it's an ongoing process. But the first law of sales today is, in no uncertain terms, the buyer is in control. It's no longer the sales organization or the selling entity that is calling the tune. So it's incumbent upon any organization to spend some time defining who their buyer is, defining the journey that buyer is taking or tends to follow as a path, and then to map your resources, your personnel, your activities to each step of that stage that buyer is in, to form your execution strategy. So all these things go into the bottle. So when you choose to introduce sales and you just want to pour it in and hope it works, you got to be sure that the ingredients are all there. So enough of the arcane references here. Let's look at those stages that any organization and especially, I think it's especially relevant to technology companies. This is a diagram which I borrowed from David Scott, who's a preeminent thought leader in the world of SaaS technology company development, software as a service. We've seen some of these terms through your, I'm sure, through your curriculum that Jen has provided to you. It's something that we focus on rather extensively at the ATDC. But beginning in those days when you were testing your hypothesis and doing your customer discovery to prove value and prove something would be marketable or sellable, ultimately you need to prove that it can be sold. There's a price. Someone is going to exchange currency or value for that. And you're going to have examples of where you might actually get some money into your bank. But the most important thing is to ensure that this is a repeatable motion. This is something that can occur with regularity and, more importantly, with predictability. Usually in those early stages, it is the founders, it is the inventors or the developers who brought the product to market who are often engaged in that sales process. At some point, however, it's going to be important to prove that those non-founders can indeed sell the product. And again, back to that notion of a repeatable sales motion, the intent to make it scalable. In other words, all I need to do is add the right people and I get more volume. You know, that depends on that repeatable sales motion. It does not depend on the technology. It makes no difference at that point about your technology. The other aspect that has to be assured along the way is that when customers take your product, they keep it. They keep it and they use it and they renew it. This is especially important in that recurring revenue model that software as a service has brought into the limelight for us. So no longer do companies, big companies selling to big companies, for example, that would have spent many months, perhaps years into sales cycles to garner multi-million-dollar contract value, it's more likely that these contract values are going to be much smaller and paid out perhaps on a monthly basis, as opposed to one time or even annual. But still, it takes time to make up the cost of selling to those clients. So the idea of making it profitable means the ability to understand your cost of selling, your customer acquisition cost, and ensuring that in that repetitive motion, you're selling to enough people at the right price to where you can recoup that cost of sales and create something referred to as a lifetime value in those clients that will pay that cost back to you so that you can report to your investors that you are actually dropping something to the bottom line at some point. All of that goes on as you look to then at some point move out of the phase of this search for repeatable and scalable growth models to a point where you're going to truly scale the business. Then it becomes a math exercise, simple as that. You're looking at your capacity models at that point. The number of qualified sales members, sales teammates, who when you add more, you can count on a certain performance level from them within a time period, so that all you're doing now is adding layers to the cake. And that's the phase. So how long is a string? Again, it depends. Depends on markets, it depends on customers, it depends on a whole number of things that are interoperating in those. So that there's no one answer here. Back to the original question about who your customer is. I can pause here and ask for any questions or anybody that wants to write into the text box, but I'll keep going until Jen, you cause me to pause and maybe take any questions if you wish.
Will do.
Okay.
Yes, if you have questions, please put them in chat.
Just back to a few basics along the way here. Again, hearkening to your early stage development through the curriculum, there's no question that your friend is product market fit. And this goes to the customer adoption and usage patterns. And some would say, people like Mark Andreessen would say, the only thing that matters is product market fit. And through whatever stage that you have, it is the ticket to the dance. Social proof is required. And it's not the accumulation of free trials or pilots, whether they're paid or not, or beta customers who are testing products and giving you feedback, sustainable businesses require a steady flow, a volume of users who pay and stay, and then renew and grow with you. So at some point, your cheapest sales will be expansion revenue coming from existing clients. So positioning yourself for that will be a fundamental part of your business strategy. In the meantime, you're out there breaking ground and looking for new customers all the time, which is obviously the most expensive form, but nonetheless, they have to be willing to pay. Looking for those early patterns of consistent buyer behavior and response, you want to follow signs that lead to development of a pipeline of qualified customers. You want to start with defining who your ideal customers are, and you want to cling to that. You don't want to shoot at anything that moves. You want to shoot at something that is consistent, that fits the diagram that you put in place that says, this is the highest odds likelihood of purchase. This type of buyer, this type of customer, this type of organization fits our profile. And we're going to continue to zoom in and target that and narrow the aperture to that and leave those things outside of that alone. Because you can spend a lot of time and money chasing rabbits. Looking for consistency in growth is really going to be measured by bookings. It's not annual recurring revenue is important. That's what the banks and the investors like, but bookings are really the indicator. And this is the thing that's going to be the proof point in your ability to grow that sales organization. But to do that, you're going to have to understand how much it costs to find, nurture, convince, and close an average deal, for example. Does your revenue or margin cover this? Probably not, especially again in that recurring revenue environment. In many cases, it could take upwards of 36 months to do that. So getting those customers to join and stay with you for 3 years might require engineering contracts that enable you to do that, because if they churn out within a period of time, much less than that, not only have you lost them as a recurring source of revenue, you have to go replace them at a higher cost. And again, you dig a hole that you have to dig out of just to get back to even. So it's important to consider that the people that you target are people that you know are the right customers, that you've spent that money carefully, diligently, but that you're going to see a return and by maintaining that customer over a lifetime.
So I have a quick question before you go, I think, on much further. Is one of the things that most of my entrepreneurs that I work with struggle with is trying to figure out how long the sales cycle is for their industry or their product.
Okay.
Any tips for them as they're just getting started to try and understand that, or questions to ask of prospects to try and hone in on? Because one of the things investors are looking for them is for them to understand the sales cycle and how long it is from first contact to close,
Sure.
right?
Well, the very scientific response to that is, of course, it depends. And it really does depend on the value proposition, and more often than not, the price point for that, because especially when you're selling in a B2B setting, if the contract value rises above a certain point, budgets and approval are engaged, and in any respect, the more people you involve in that decision, the more political the process is, the more approvals that are required, and that extends your sales cycle. When you're in a consumer environment, B2C, of course, you can make discretionary spending decisions yourself, your committee of one, you can hit a button, apply your credit card, and you're done. But if you're selling capital goods to a commercial entity like Gulfstream, for example, they're going to go through a vetting process. They're going to engage competitors. So they're going to evaluate other players in that space. And again, everybody's going to come to the table with biases and favorites. So there's going to be a conversation. That's the thing that extends sales cycles more than anything else. It's the politics of the decision making. So the sooner you know who the right type of customer is, the sooner you can get to high-level decision makers who can authorize and approve spending, the sooner you can notice that your decision process will be shorter or less than if you walk into a situation cold as another competitor in that discussion. Does that make sense, Jen, as far as your conversation? I, for one, come from a background of selling high-end capital expenditure type solutions. And, you know, again, in my early days with IBM, we might start a conversation with a client and get a win 2 years later. That's painful, but, you know, I think for the most part, today's sales cycles in an environment, a platform where you're selling, you know, a five-figure, you know, high four, maybe a five-figure sum, $10,000 to $25,000, you may certainly expect a sales cycle of anywhere from 3 to 4 months, I would say, only because unless somebody's coming out of a pocket change or out of petty cash, they're going to have to go to somebody for approval, a CFO, for example, and they're going to take time.
Yeah. The other big thing I used to see a lot was entrepreneur come into my office, especially at ACDC. They come in like, I want to sell to Coke. I'm like, great, awesome. Who'd you talk to at Coke? And I'm like, oh, my neighbor works for Coke.
Yeah.
And they love my idea.
Yeah.
So I want to sell to Coke. I'm like, great, well, what does your neighbor do at Coke? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, what? And then they'd be like, but they're going to help me get connected to the right people. I'm like, great. Like,
everybody gets stars in their eyes when it comes to those marquee logos that you want on your reference list. But the bigger they are, the harder they fall. There's just no two ways about it. And again, it's because of the politics of decision making. You know, there's finance involved, but, you know, numbers can be taken in any different directions. It's convincing people and moving the needle as far as the personal commitment to make and live with the decision, because a lot of people have their careers on the line when these decisions get made. And so they don't want to be wrong. And there's safety in numbers. So again, a lot of platitudes there, but it takes as long as it takes. Now, that said, a lot of companies are trying to get better at this, and they're distributing or diversifying. What's the right word I'm looking for here? Just distributing is the right word, to local users. And one of the advantages of the SaaS model is that you have reduced your price point, if you will, to a monthly figure or a lower annual cost, as opposed to a total cost of ownership number that might have existed from years before. But still, those budgets are going to have to be dealt with year after year. We can certainly come back to that, or we can get into specific examples as they present themselves. One of the questions that you posed, Jen, I think in the early going of this discussion was, when or how should they hire their first salespeople? And I think the long and the short of it is, in the development of these businesses, you can expect, and the founder should expect, that for the foreseeable future, in the early stages, certainly of 12 to 24 months at least, that you are the chief sales officer and should plan to be the chief sales officer. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The reasons include presumably nobody knows the product or technology or value proposition better than you. Companies that you're going to work with, especially big companies, who may even be interested at all in taking a risk on a startup, are going to want to deal with ownership and the people in charge. But you're going to need to understand and vet that process. You're going to have to figure out what it takes for those buyers to let go of their money. So it's important for founders and if you will, the CEOs of those companies to really become first order salespeople and really understand and get what it takes to profitably attract and grow a satisfied customer. So after some period of time, when that repetitive sales motion, and let's call it 5 to 10 customers, the first 5 to 10. And I've got a quote here from Jason Lemkin, who's the founder of SaaSter out in the West Coast. And I think he's another forward thinker in this space. This is his notion as well, that, founders should expect to close the first 5 or 10 for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is they need to become very comfortable with what it takes before they make the effort to hire their first sales leader. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, the failure rate of the first sales leader is extraordinarily high. It's upwards of 80%. 80% of first sales hires fail. And there are reasons for that as well. And I'll get into some of those. But if you have gotten through this motion and are now prepared to look for someone, you might think of bringing aboard not a big name, big brand executive VP of sales, but perhaps a sales director who's willing to act as a I call him a Trailblazer or a Pathfinder rep for a number of months. That's a player coach attitude perhaps, and have that person operate in this environment for a number of years, perhaps while adding 1 or 2 more just like that person, before you can really determine that you've got this predictable, repeatable sales motion locked down. That's a generality, but I think it's a very recognizable pattern. So again, looking to how much time is involved in this. Your early stage as a CEO, is 12 to 24 months. The next phase, possibly 12 to 24, upwards of 36 months before you think that you're ready to hit the gas and go scale this thing by adding reps that you can hire off the street with relevant experience, bring them in, onboard them, train them. And the question is, who's going to train them at this point? Who's going to give them the right and wrong? The thing that the sales director, the Pathfinder, the Trailblazer will do that's of most value is sort of creating that first sales playbook. And that's really the thing that you can bring and onboard new players with, people whom you can spend perhaps less money on and get more utility from, and perhaps find more of those people in a shorter time frame. But before you get there, someone has got to break the code. So,
Steve, David had a question on hiring probably the sales director type, or that first bleeding trailblazer. And it's, so many sales candidates are terrific at selling themselves, but aren't necessarily good at selling the product that you're producing. So any tips for weaning out the guys and gals who talk a good game, but aren't good when they actually get on the field?
I think that's a great question. And that is one of the primary causes of the failure rate that we described. And I'll jump ahead a little bit because I have a whole slide dedicated to that, but let me just give spoiler alert. Founders who, are in this motion early are doing it because A, they have to, B, they've been told they need to. Aren't in their comfort zone very often. They're technology people in many cases. They want to get back to doing what they like best. And they're eager to hand this off to somebody that can, be their representative and be the guy, be the gal who's got the name that they can hold up to investors and hold up to customers and say, look at us, we've got a player here. And so they get stars in their eyes and they go looking for resumes, and they find people who maybe worked for big companies or name brand companies or companies that are relevant to their industry segment who've had success, but established companies. And they try to recruit or poach those people and bring them in, or they've gotten referrals from their investors and friends that says someone had a remarkable sales track record somewhere else. Why don't you try them on here? And so they go down that path and they take it on faith that these people know what to do, know how to run a sales organization and find customers. But the realities on the ground are different in a startup. You walk in the door and they don't have the staff, they don't have the budget, they don't necessarily have the familiarity with the nature or the type of customers or the value proposition that they've been engaged with in the past. And oh, by the way, it's them. all by themselves, and they don't have, a lot of people around them to give direction to. So they have to go do it themselves, and they flounder at that point. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's a pretty typical scenario. And again, there's a prescriptive here that I'm suggesting that you want to avoid that scenario without a significant amount of vetting and a significant amount of reference checking to make that work. Did I answer your question? Did that help?
Yeah. Leads me to another question, but I'm going to hold it and see where we're going here for a sec.
All right. Well, again, not to over dwell on the subject, but the Trailblazers, the people here, they're a different breed. They're a breed apart. There's no doubt about it. Some are naturals, some are accidents, some are conscripts. They've been thrust into the situation or taken out of the tech arena and plugged into sales. And some people can hit a home run doing this, but in a lot of cases, the first sales hires are also, and more so today, they begin with an inside sales orientation, where because of the nature of the selling that can be done, they can leverage the phone and social media and email to drum up certainly leads and conversations and perhaps appointments, and even conduct primary sales conversations remotely, and turn that over to founders and other people in that leadership role. And so very often it looks like the first step in this direction may be building the equivalent of what we used to call telesales, inside sales, but there's a whole sub-segment of the market now that's grown up around that and makes a lot of sense because, again, back to the buyers who are in control, they are accustomed to this as well. They are accustomed now to taking calls and doing Zoom meetings for sales. So it's possible that you can bring people with more of an inside sales background to this. Nonetheless, these people are fearless. The right ones are fearless. They know how to, and they have to take no for an answer a lot. So they're able to take rejection and handle that and let it wash off them, and they keep going, and they learn how to play the numbers game that's involved in trying to call, dial for dollars, make lots of calls and get people on the phone and do this. Now, that's a whole different discussion for another day on the right way to go about doing that. But this does tend to enter into the conversation when you think about introducing sales into your operation. It's a step in that direction in some cases before bringing that permanent high dollar direct sales individual, account executive, if you will, or sales executive into the game. The idea of building that sales machine, of building that playbook, there's going to be trial and error involved. Some things are universal and fundamental, but others are going to be a function of the situations, of the markets that we're in, the technology realm that you're addressing or utilizing, the audience, social aspects. I mean, there's a lot of different things that affect. So there's no, again, formula. But I think you minimize error and you minimize lost time by, again, paying very close attention to the customer, how they buy, how they prefer to buy, what they expect when they buy, and what their expected outcomes lead to in terms of the payback on the investment. Because at the end of the day, the best way of walking into this thing and instrumenting your sales machine is having a rock solid business case. And I think that becomes a fundamental element that has to be brought to bear inside of this. It's not about the technology. It's about what the technology can do for you and what you can do to put money on your bottom line as the customer. At some point when you've introduced sales, someone's going to rise to the point of serving as the sales manager. And again, this is where the organizational model begins to take shape. again, the timing for this needs to take into account that this is the most expensive function that you can introduce to your business. Sales in and of itself, if you have committed to a direct sales operation, for example, is going to cost money. You want to ensure then that this process is predictable, repeatable, and profitable. And again, we go back to some of those building blocks or foundation elements that we discussed earlier, because the mandate will be for growth ultimately. The mandate coming from the investors is going to be to grow the business and to ensure that you can scale. And scaling the business means scaling sales. Scaling sales means continually recruiting. Sales is the hardest thing to recruit for now. The reason for that is there's a high degree of turnover in the sales world. Some of the recent statistics point to the fact that fewer than 60% of the salespeople of record today, it's actually closer to 50% now, make their numbers on an annual basis. So there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of churn. Recruiting is a continuous activity. Training and onboarding ensures that the people that you bring on board stick and can do the work. The job of the sales manager goes then beyond that to ensuring that they are providing one-on-one guidance, and that's the coaching. That's the coaching that occurs in those one-on-ones, the deal pipeline management, the forecast. I mean, it is more than a full-time job. But ultimately, they're responsible for ensuring that forecast is met and making the number. And so all of that is fundamental. The ingredients involved in that is assure that you've got the right people in the right jobs all the time. Ultimately, their job as you mature is to ensure that they've developed the sales strategy and they're able to teach that effectively, so that sales playbook we talked about describes the target market, the positioning, the messaging, the interoperability with the marketing function that obviously is going to be responsible for lead generation, and again, back to messaging. But then once in place, understanding the velocity of the pipeline, how deals are progressing through that pipeline and converting into sales, and looking for the phases and stages and tendencies and those clues and triggers that says we can in fact win this business. Those are all the province of the sales management function.
Steve, one of the things I've seen happen multiple times is that the Trailblazer person was promised this job, and this job makes the Trailblazer miserable. Have you seen that? Because
of, in your experience, Jen, what are you attributing that to?
I think because the Trailblazer likes blazing new trails.
They are very independent.
Right, they're really independent. They liked making the playbook. They liked figuring out how to get to that sale, when it wasn't you do these 5 steps every single time and it's you're done, right?
Yep.
And so then if they were promised kind of the VP of sales or sales manager job, the forecasting and the training onboarding and that stuff just doesn't get them excited like the figuring out how to sell the first 10 copies did.
You're absolutely right.
But the personality of that job and this job just do not match. This is make every day the same. That job is every day's different. And it falls apart, and because this person is the wrong person for this, that person's the wrong person for this job. They were promised it, they wanted the title, but now they're miserable.
And again, that's almost typical. That's not uncommon at all. And I don't, in making this transition from this early stage where you've got the Trailblazer and you're breaking new ground and you're figuring it out before it's really figured out, you've got people that are adventurers. I mean, I'm sure there's an analog here in the development team as well, where the people who are the real inventive creative developers who think they're going to be the chief technology officer of the operation once they get to a point where, the product is baked and it's working. They sort of, it loses some of the excitement of having, to break that new ground. I mean, I'm sure there's some similarities in that model as well. So I think the reality is, in the development of corporations, organizations, companies like this, the people that get you from 0 to, let's say, 2 million may not be the people that get you from 2 to 10, and they're certainly not the people that get you from 10 to 50. There's going to be change, and there's going to be turnover in that regard, because at every stage of development, you're looking at a new set of models and disciplines that are going to call for certain talents and preferences among your players. And so it's important to take that into account as well and plan for that.
Thanks.
The idea for hiring or behind hiring additional salespeople, and again, I don't want to leap too far ahead here, because now we're talking about a system when the wheels are really, the gears are really turning, and you're able to, and you're thinking about hitting the gas. This is more for a discussion of planning, of when your process is repeatable, and when you're thinking about just hiring salespeople. Again, it's not liquid plumber. You just don't pour it in and it works. But when you get to this point, you're changing from decisions about, okay, how does a customer buy and what feature or what element is really going to trigger their buying behavior, to, I'm going to bring salespeople on, and my business is going to depend on the number of ramped sales representatives who are going to produce an average of $650,000 in quota each year. And I'm going to expect that 2 out of 8 salespeople are going to leave. That means I'm going to have to replace them. I'm going to have to train them. So my average of ramped salespeople is going to be this in a period of time, which will give me this in terms of revenue. And I'm going to grow this at a certain rate, which means I'm going to ramp my hire. That's the discussion down the road when you're hitting the gas, right? But understand that you get to the point where it is a math exercise. You're looking at a demand gen model that says, I've got an average deal size of X, I've got a close rate of 25%, I've got an average sales cycle of 6 months. Back to your question about sales cycle. So an example would be, if I've got to meet $1 million to get to get my quarterly quota, $1 million per quarter, and my average deal size is 100K, I need 10 deals. All right, if I've got a conversion rate of 25%, that means I've got to have 40 qualified deals. If my sales cycle is 4 months, that means I've got to have 40 deals in my pipeline 1 full quarter ahead of the quarter I'm in right now. So understanding those metrics and understanding that I have the people in place to give me that gives me confidence that a forecast that I'm putting together from my board is going to be met. It's not that, oh, I've got this opportunity sitting there. That's not the earmark. That's not the measure. It doesn't tell me anything other than I've got an opportunity in Salesforce right now. That opportunity may have been sitting there for 2 years. It should have closed or should have been eliminated a year ago. Okay? So you really need to understand what those metrics are looking like. And that's, again, a function of the people and the process that you put in place here to ensure this predictability. Here's that, back to the spoiler alert for a minute. The mistakes to avoid in hiring that sales leader is hiring her because she's got a big title, because she came from, if I'm in the marketing automation business, for example, and I hire somebody, from one of the big players, I've got a new and different kind of thing that I'm going to try to disrupt that marketplace with, because that person came from that big company. Doesn't necessarily mean she's going to fit. Doesn't mean she's going to fit the culture. Doesn't mean she's going to fit the circumstances that involve the fact that I've got very little resource here. I've got little money to spend on marketing. I've got little money to spend on on people. I'm asking her to do a lot of the work herself, etc. So placing too much weight on that, placing too much weight on industry experience, even though that's a comfort zone. It's especially a comfort zone, by the way, for investors, and I get that. But again, the thing about the industry experience usually means they've come from a company, they've been at it a long time, they've risen in the ranks, and they've gotten away from the hands-on activity. I'd much rather have someone that's got some real aggressive sales experience in first-line sales leadership background straight away, because they're going to have to do some of that work themselves, and they're going to have to coach others every day. And so they've got to have that go-to-market. They've got to be able to understand how to zig, how to zag, how to adapt to what the market and the customer engagements are giving them, and not just pull out an old playbook from some other time. Okay. So the sales process development experience, in my mind, is very key. Overlooking that, or the experience with that, and the tendency to bring that to bear in situations is important. And the last point is having someone that's a good pitchman or pitch person is feels good, but the fact is, again, buyers are in control. Buyers have different thinking and different processes themselves, and someone's got to really be able to get underneath that and bring value to every conversation they're having. That's the consultative seller model. So in terms of those mistakes to avoid, back to the sales management focus, I think winning companies are winning cultures. Sales cultures are important. And even in some of the most technologically oriented companies, you notice the most successful ones, they celebrate a sales culture. They may not have any salespeople per se. This may be product-led growth, but what they're really saying is, I've got a culture of going after and pleasing the customer and finding those customers where they live and getting them to make a move toward me in my business and my solution in a shorter time, better than the competition. The people that do that, whether they know it or not, are in sales. And, but the culture there that surrounds that is important. And so sales can't be relegated to, the black art, or can't be relegated to a necessary evil. I mean, those companies don't tend to do very well. There has to be an appreciation for sales so that you can hire the best people and grow them within the operation, that they can advance, to your point earlier about the career path. They know that they're going to see reward, and they're going to have a seat at the table in terms of authority and participation in the management decision making. The key job of the sales leaders are ensuring you got the right people in the right roles at all times, that you're retaining them, that you're remediating any problems that may be required, and you're recruiting all the time. The sales process is pretty simple. You're going to aim them in the right direction. You're going to arm them with the right materials and messaging, and you're going to monitor their progress continuously. The progression is such that again, there's nobody more measurable in the company than sales. No organization and the leadership thereof is certainly the most measured in the company. So the results are paramount. The way to manage that is not in the rearview mirror by just deciding whether or not they can make a forecast, but maintaining constant oversight of the pipeline and the activities that go into moving opportunities through that pipeline. The most important thing these sales leaders can be doing is making sure that they are continuously engaged in one-on-one coaching and meetings with their people, and that when they have sales meetings, those meetings are high value, and they inspire people and they move people into the path. I've got a lot of different articles and discussions that I have in the slides. Jen, I don't know if they were in the copy that I sent you, but I've got a number of links to relevant articles that support these points that I've made. So if I didn't send it to you the first time, I'll be happy to share it. The last point, and I know we're close to time here, but you had asked about the questions about your friend that had a question around compensation. Because of the developmental nature of this business and moving through those stages that we described, by definition, you're going to have different structures and orientations to compensation. Your established companies, you're going to have fixed quotas, and they're going to have measurements, and they're going to have people that make and don't make quotas, and they're going to get rewarded and compensated or fired or promoted based upon their ability to make that. That doesn't always necessarily, or can't always necessarily apply in the early stages, when you really haven't even figured out your pricing model yet. You really haven't figured out what the market will bear in terms of what your customers are prepared to pay. But to get someone in front of those customers, someone who can engage in the sales activity while you're figuring out, the idea of putting them on a salary and a draw guarantee based on meeting goals, specific goals or objectives in key measurements that flow into a stage where you're actually targeting, for example, your logos, your reference accounts. It's important to get big name companies to claim they're your customer. And so, notwithstanding the amount that they're prepared to spend, you might target based upon the idea of bringing a new customer in the door. And so you might look at a minimum number of target accounts that are agreed to at the start of the year and say, I need to get 6 of these brand logos in here. And for that, you're going to be compensated at a certain threshold. The next phase might be that short-term quota, when we're at the point where we've actually got qualified leads coming in the door and a pipeline that is valid or that is validatable, and I can start looking at my ratios of what it's going to take, how many deals I'm going to have, or how many opportunities I'm going to have to close deals. And I can begin to look at performance-based quotas, maybe on a 6-month basis as opposed to an annual basis, and adjust those as you determine as necessary. Before you get to that predictive ramp where I'm a new hire coming in, it's going to take me 9 months to ramp up. I'm going to go on quota in my 4th quarter. I'm going to hit a certain number every quarter after that, and that's going to grow each quarter. But I'm going to have other metrics that I'm going to be responsible for. And it may be some combination of new accounts versus add-on revenue with existing clients, versus hitting with certain spiffs for, new products coming out that I want to introduce. All those things can come into play once you have an established model for quota and compensation. But again, you don't necessarily apply that in the early stages until you've got that predictability that we described. So that's really all I had in terms of
So
slides.
I have another question that I need to ask. I've had a couple of people ask me about outsourcing sales. Mm-hmm. Finding another organization that's selling to a similar client and allowing them to kind of sell both products or whatnot. Thoughts on outsourcing sales? To me, I just go, like, that's my revenue generation activity. Would I really want to give it over to somebody else? But
exactly. Well, it goes to those questions that we posed at the early stage. I mean, again, not the least of which is control. That's why the CEOs are so important to be participating at the early stage. But at some point, that decision, again, depending on the market, depending on the technology, depending on the value prop, the solution that you're selling, could be handed over to a channel partner, for example. And channels represent an option for outsourcing. You're working with value-added resellers, or you're working with integrators who are going to incorporate your product into their solutions, perhaps. That's one model. And in the world of SaaS, Originally, that was not contemplated very readily, and there wasn't a lot of affinity on the part of the channel partners either because of the price
Okay.
points. But that's changing because they see that that's elemental in many cases to the buying decisions that their customers are making. So that's changing. And in fact, there are people, companies like N3 here in Atlanta that are in truth an outsourced sales company. I mean, literally, you can hire an outsourced sales development representative. You can hire a BDR. You can hire an AE to go represent. Uh, and again, there's a cost for that.
Okay.
Uh, but that cost is different than the cost you have of bringing that person into your organization itself. So what's right for you? I think you've exemplified one thing. And first of all, it's an attitude, about control, or it's a preference relative to control. I think it also has to determine if it's relevant to your industry segment and to your customer's buying proposition. So
Awesome.
I don't know if I answered that
Yeah,
question
yeah,
or
it's
not.
it's kind of like the entrepreneurs that I coach would go to some sort of startup lounge or investor meetings or places where they could meet a lot of investors. And I'd be like, how'd it go? They'd be like, great. I gave out my business card to so-and-so. I'm like, did you get theirs? And they'd say no. And I'd be like, oh,
Mhm.
you always want to be in control. You want to get their card, not the other way
That's
around. Now
right.
you're waiting for them to call you. You're an entrepreneur.
That's right.
So do we have any other questions from the group? If not, I do want to be mindful of people's time. So Steve, this was excellent. Thank you for sharing. And this will go live on our website probably tomorrow, since today's a little crazy. And I'll be sure to reference some of those links that Steve gave us so that you can follow up as well. So I'm going to stop recording.